Welcome back to Murder in the Black. It is your host, Steph.
And I'm MD.
Let's go ahead and get into our true crime case for today.
So grab your coffee if it's the morning, your lemonade if it's the afternoon, or your wine if it's the evening. But either way, let's get into it.
Let's get into it. Shout out to Brandy and another one of our listeners. This is a listener suggestion. And as we have said previously on other episodes, we love to hear from you. This is straight from our listeners whom we love. So shout out to Brandy and our other listener. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, but you know who you are. Our case today comes out of New Orleans, Louisiana, the birthplace of jazz. And I think everybody stateside have a personal affection for New Orleans. At least I do. It has a special place in my heart.
Louisiana is just a unique, and you know we are Texas true and true over here, right? Die hard, Texas is the best state ever. But like, I don't know, it's something about Louisiana. It just has its own vibe, its own culture. And I mean, it literally almost could be its own country in a way.
I think so.
I feel like when I'm there, it's just like, I feel like I'm just, somewhere altogether different. But yeah.
Yeah, shout out to you if you are from New Orleans. On Saturday, March 4th, 1995, around 2 a.m., 23-year-old Antoinette Frank arrived first to a scene in New Orleans. She received a phone call. She was a police officer. She was off duty, got a phone call of a violent crime, and decided to show up. Now, it was an armed robbery. It occurred at a Vietnamese restaurant called Kim An's Restaurant. On scene, 3 people were gunned down, and minutes after Antoinette arrived, more officers arrived on scene as well. On the floor lied a security guard who was shot 3 times. And initially, investigators and police officers felt like it was just a regular security guard. But upon further investigation, they found out that it was actually an officer. It was their fellow police officer of the New Orleans Police Department. His name was Ronnie Williams. Now, he was off duty and worked as a security guard for the restaurant. And just 10 days earlier, he actually celebrated the birth of his second child. My heart goes out to Ronnie's family. I want to stop here before I go on to what they further investigated and found on scene, because whenever fellow police officers find out that another police officer was involved, it's like I don't want to say it's any different than finding somebody else in the community, but it kind of hits different, right? Because they are more dedicated. And I'm kind of like tiptoeing around my words. I don't want to say more dedicated, but they are very intense on finding out who it is.
And I think it is different, Steph, because like they're first responders, right? Like, so this is somebody, generally, right? We're not talking about every single cop that ever existed, but generally people who go into this profession as a police officer or, a firefighter, they are people who are very literally saying, I'm willing to risk my life for the sake of others in the community.
It's a tribe, communal.
Absolutely.
That was definitely the case here. And as they further investigated, they made their way to the kitchen and they saw 2 people deceased, shot at point blank range. Their names were 24-year-old Ha Vu and her brother Quang Vu, who was 17 years old. They worked in their family business, and the victims were shot multiple times and twice in the head. They were shot by someone who was skilled with the gun.
There was a witness on scene, and it was a woman that ran to the front door and charged the police officers. Her name was Chow Vu. Now, she was the sister of the deceased that was found in the kitchen during the murders. She hid in the restaurant's refrigerator, and she heard the executions of her sister and brothers. Can you imagine that? Like, you were able to hide in a place that, probably nobody is really going to come search for you in a restaurant's refrigerator. But you're hearing your sister, your sister and brother are still out there. and you hear them being executed. I mean, I can't even imagine this. As a person who has siblings, you and my brother, I can't imagine, you know, having to sit through that, the trauma that you live with for the rest of your life.
Absolutely. It was horrific, I'm sure.
And investigators hoped for more information about the shooters. And in her shock, she started speaking Vietnamese, which makes sense to me because I think when you are in shock, you're gonna just kind of divert to your nomenclature, what's easy and normal for you, and that's what she did. It left the detectives though hopeless because they couldn't understand what she was attempting to say. And as soon as Chow Vu came from the restaurant's front door, another witness emerged on the scene, and it was Antoinette Frank, following close behind Chow. And she claimed that she did see the perpetrators, right? She's telling the officers, I saw them, I witnessed them.
Now, her story, her meaning Antoinette's story, was she saw three armed males leaving the restaurant through the front door and driving off in a dark colored car. Now, I'm uncertain on what type of car that was, but obviously her description was well thought out. And I want to bring your attention to the fact that investigators and people who are police officers, they're trained in how to identify people. It is not the same way that you and I would go around talking about different people. And they trusted her eye because she was a police officer as well. And she also claimed that she got Chow and her brother, who was no longer on scene, to safety. And they put out the information once they were able to get the full description from Antoinette concerning the perpetrators. They put that information out to other police vehicles and actually were able to pull over a car matching the description. However, after searching the vehicle and talking to the person who was driving the car, who had no criminal history, they didn't find any evidence in the car matching the evidence that was on scene. The lead was ultimately a dead end and they had to let the person go. Now, investigators further examined the restaurant and they recovered casings of a 9mm gun. Now, this is a little different than what I've heard in other cases that we've talked about. They'll recover 9mm shell casing, but this particular shell casing was marked by manufacturer's stamp and it came from a single weapon, just meaning that the same weapon was used in all three homicides. Now, Kwang's wallet was also missing, and this obviously looked like it was a botched robbery. Now, investigators turn to Antoinette for answers. She informs them that, like Officer Ronnie, she would work at the restaurant as an off duty police officer just to get more hours to get some more money, right? Like, I mean, after all, police officers are amongst a lot of first responders and people who help the community that just don't make a whole lot of money. So she was supplementing her income there at Kim An's restaurant. Now, the Vus considered her a friend of the family because not only was she working there as an off duty police officer, but she also was, stopping by sometimes when she wasn't even working because that's how much of a close friend they viewed her. She'd come by, pick up food. She was a friend of the family. However, despite this very friendly description that she was giving to investigators at the time, they noticed that Chow Vu seemed to be very nervous around Antoinette during this entire interaction. When Antoinette would try to talk to her or try to just get close to her, Chow Vu actually would like appear nervous and scared of Antoinette. And this just seemed to rub investigators the wrong way.
And, obviously she's traumatized, right? From hearing the execution of her siblings, to having to hide, being scared and fearful of her life. And now she's also, she's speaking in Vietnamese because she is so shocked. And then now every time she gets close to Antoinette, she like seems to be afraid and fearful. And so investigators are able to eventually calm Child down. And after she is somewhat able to be composed, she tells investigators that Antoinette didn't rescue her or her brother from the masked gunman, but in fact, it was Antoinette Frank that imposed this this crime. This was beyond surprising for investigators, as you can absolutely imagine, because here they are relying on Antoinette. They're pulling over cars as a result of what her description is. And they're relying on her simply because, like Steph said in the beginning, this is a fellow officer. Obviously, she's trained the way we're trained. She is going to identify and be aware of things that, like, maybe lay people who are not officers are going to pay attention to. They're surprised to hear Chow point the finger at Antoinette, and they wonder, is she mistaken? Like, is she sure that this is the person, or is this fear? Because maybe the person looks similar to Antoinette.
Yeah. And to your point of her being like speaking in Vietnamese and being shook up by all the things that she has seen, like maybe she's confused. Like maybe she doesn't have the story quite right.
Right. And because there also is this element of shock that happens, right, Steph? Like when you're in a very traumatic situation where you can conflate, if Antoinette came and rescued her, was it Antoinette that rescued her, or was it Antoinette that inflicted, this? I can't. It's all coming together, and and that's also part of the reason why investigators will question you multiple times after they've already questioned you, not because they think that you're lying, but because they recognize that there are certain facts your brain may forget to protect you, like in a way of protection. But the investigation proceeds, right? And they do find that there are some inconsistencies in Antoinette's story. She claimed that she saved these victims from this mass robber and pushed the remaining victims out the back door during the shooting. The back door, it was locked from the inside. It didn't make any sense to investigators. Are like, I don't really understand how she was able to do this. But again, they understand this, that oftentimes you can think you do something in the middle of a shocking and traumatic situation that maybe you don't have the facts all the way clear in the very first conversation. They continue to investigate, but they are noticing now, their antennas are alerted to Antoinette, and they noticed that Antoinette's behavior on scene was odd. She re-entered the kitchen to look at the bodies. She looked dazed, kind of off a little. Chavu wasn't the only one who hid in the refrigerator. Her brother, Kwok, also saw the murders. He was responsible for making the 911 call to the police. And as he spoke with the investigators upon arriving back on the scene, he backed up every single thing that his sister Chow told the investigators.
Antoinette was responsible, or so it seemed. And it was enough evidence and inconsistencies within her story and two witnesses who said, no, it was her. At 3:53 a.m., she was arrested on suspicion of murder. They then executed a search warrant on her car, and inside of her car, they found a single 9mm shell casing. It was the same brand of ammunition found at the crime scene. Remember, it had that manufacturer stamp, and it also matched. Many cops are trained in the technique of double tap shoot, which is essentially, you've heard it before in cases where police are having to shoot. And that means to shoot until the threat is gone. You're not trying to shoot to injure. You are shooting until the threat is completely gone. Eyewitness Kwok Vu said that Antoinette wasn't the only person on scene. People keep popping up, right? I mean, like, Chow Vu comes out of the crime scene. Shortly after that, there goes Antoinette. Then all of a sudden, Kwok Vu is there. It's like, man, who else is
wasn't at this crime scene at this point?
Exactly. Like, who? Kwok Vu actually sits down with detectives and he gives them a physical description of the assailant. They were able to show him pictures of suspects, and he affirmed that the person that he saw on scene was Roger Lacaze. Roger Lacaze was not unknown to police officers. He was a criminal, a serial criminal at that. But when they retraced Roger's movements, they discovered that he filled up his gas tank after the murders, and he paid using Ronnie's credit card. And remember, Ronnie was the officer who was shot on scene. Now, the only way that he could have got Ronnie's credit card was he had to be at the crime scene with Antoinette.
The question becomes, who is Antoinette Frank? I mean, who is this person, right? And we know she's a cop, but more details about Antoinette. Antoinette was born in the small town of Opelousas, Louisiana. She lived a poor life, and when she was 13, she witnessed her brother arrested for armed robbery and attempted manslaughter. Her father was a war veteran, and she desired a better life for herself. And I really believe that oftentimes when you're in such depressed types of situations like that, you usually are saying, like, how can I get out? Or you go the exact opposite way and you say, I'm going to embrace this lifestyle. This is just what it is. But for Antoinette, she decided that her goal was that she wanted to have a better life for herself. And as a result, she decided, I want to become a police officer. And she applied the moment that she was eligible to become a police officer, which was at 20 years old. And she attended the police academy and joined the force. Now, while this describes a little bit of her background, how could she, this person who wanted better for her life, who saw what a life of crime can get you, how could this individual, right, be involved with a career criminal known to authorities? Like, how did this tie between Antoinette and Roger, occur? Murder, 5 months before the murder, a street shooting over drugs sent one man to the hospital and another one to the morgue. Now, Antoinette interviews the guy that was wounded, the individual, and his name was Roger Lacasse. Now, although it is said they might have met 8 months prior to the murder, many people believe that this was the critical point of contact when Roger and Antoinette just kind of sealed the relationship that became instrumental in this murder.
Now, there was a spark between the two. They made a connection. Naturally, one may wonder what was the connection that existed between the two. For him, it might have been she had power and authority. He was a career criminal. He could use that to his advantage. And for her, it could be the tried and true attraction to the guy who is a bad guy. He has a troubled past. Maybe even let me try to fix him. Their mysterious link evolved into a romantic relationship, and it is known that officers actually observed Lacasse driving her vehicle and witnessed him moving her police unit at the scene of an accident she was investigating. On one occasion, Lacasse accompanied her on a complaint call where she introduced him as a trainee. On other occasion, she introduced Lacasse as her nephew. Prior to the murder, others testified that Frank and Lacasse would pull over people and rob them while in her squad car. She was bold. That's very bold. And I even think for people, fellow police officers were the ones who told that they saw her doing these things. I don't know. I think people must have just either, I don't think it's a I don't care attitude, but just a trust in your fellow officer, and or it could be both. But they also could just be like, that's not my business. Because to see that is kind of it's wild to me.
Well, and I think that it's not my business is such a prevailing cultural United States cultural thing, right? Like, I'm on my business. I think that's crazy. But then I also think that, you may have this element of, I don't really know all the details. Maybe she's in, some undercover unit. I don't know. Maybe she's trying to, do something that I don't know about, so I think that there's probably so many different factors
Yeah, I don't think it's a black and white, but it's interesting how we are easily to dismiss things that may seem a little off.
I agree.
Especially as we talk about follow your guttural instincts. I bet looking back, that was very disturbing.
Yeah.
But for whatever the reason, in the journey to try to discover what was the ultimate factor that led to Antoinette's downfall, people started to reanalyze her process in getting into the police force. And as a part of her application to become an officer, she underwent a psychological evaluation. I mean, that was natural. They do that in the Army, they do that in the police department. Now, when she got into the interview, she wore something that was not typical. you're thinking casual, casual dressy, maybe a nice
Business
top and some
cash.
jeans.
Yeah,
Yeah,
business casual.
that seems about right. But not Antoinette. She actually wore a cocktail dress to her psychological evaluation, which was off, especially looking back at it 2020. But it was a little off for the psychologist because that's who I'm getting this account from. He said, like that was weird. I never saw anybody do that. Now, she boasted about her connections in law enforcement. I know this person, like just name dropping, right? Like all the people she knew in law enforcement. And during the interview, she was caught in several lies. I'm going to give you guys an example. They asked her, was she ever fired from a job? They knew that she was fired from a job, right? They were able to go back and retrace her employment history. So they were just waiting for her to be honest, like, yeah. And she said, no, I was never fired from a job. Yeah. And they caught her in several more of those little lies. Why are you lying here? We don't really understand.
But Steph, because now I would be wondering, are you a pathological liar at this point?
Right. And I think you're exactly hitting on what I'm about to say next. In addition to the psychological test that she did, she also took a character trait test. And, I'm trying to think of a popular one, but you guys know there are several character traits tests that you took in high school, in college, and she failed that. And I think that speaks to her character of just lying while she was in the psychological evaluation. And he felt, based on all the information that he collected via her evaluation and that character trait test, she did not have the psychological makeup to become an officer. And he actually gave the recommendation to the New Orleans Police Department that she should not be hired. And when she found this out, she was distressed. She was absolutely off her rocker. She didn't know what to do. And she actually wrote a suicide note expressing her intent to end her life. But the following day, she behaved totally normal. You would think that nothing was wrong with her. And she was able to garner enough attention from all those people that she name dropped, that she knew in the police department. Eventually, she was able to be hired as a New Orleans police officer, gain entrance into the New Orleans Police Department, and slip through the cracks, if you will.
That is a big slip through the crack. Because that's, even if, the psychological evaluation proved that she should not be hired, right? I feel like the suicide note that she wrote after subsequently should have been the nail in the coffin. You're not psychologically ready to join. Here you are ready to end your life at the first sign of disappointment, right? At the station, she maintained her earlier status that she was indeed the hero of the story. Now, they confronted her with eyewitness testimony, and she then backs up and said it was Roger's plan, and she was forced to go along with it. She immediately, once they start saying, hey, listen, your ducks are not in a row, they're not adding up. We have eyewitness testimony that puts you at the crime scene and not in a heroic manner, like you're trying to say. Well, then she begins to flip, like most criminals do, right? They change their story up. And she says, hey, Rogers made me do this. The tried and true. I was forced to go along with it, and so I did. They apprehend Rogers, and he told his side of the story. And he claimed that Antoinette Frank attacked the restaurant owner on her own. And the motive for this attack was revenge. She had asked the Vu family for extra shifts because, remember, Steph said that Antoinette worked there because she was trying to get additional money. Being a police officer, there's only so much money you're going to get. Most people pick up extra shifts, work as security officers here and there. And Antoinette wasn't the only officer that worked at the restaurant. She was trying to get more shifts, and they said no. They had assigned the work to other officers. Well, Antoinette was desperate for money, and she was unable to work because she didn't get those extra shifts. So she decided to take it. Roger states that he was not involved in the murders at all. He did tell the officers that Antoinette gave him a handgun, but he remained in the car the entire time and he did not enter the restaurant. It was said, she said scenario. Who was right? Was it Antoinette Frank, the police officer, or was it Rogers, the career criminal? Well, they confront Frank with Rogers' account, right? So they go back to Antoinette. It's kind of like a let me talk to you, and I'm gonna take your story back, and you know how police officers do. So they take Roger's story back to Antoinette, and they say, "Listen, this is what he's saying." And guess what she does, Steph? She changes her story again because
Oh, okay. You know
that's what
what?
they do. It's like, okay, well, let me try to make my story line up even more. And she says that she murders Kwang and Han Vu because Rogers forced her to. He put a gun to her head and he left her with no other options. Now, after confessing to the murders, she didn't understand its implication, which is absolutely bizarre to me, how she did not understand the implications of confessing to these murders, because it's like literally her job to understand that as a police officer. She didn't think, though, that she was going to lose her job by confessing to these murders, but in fact, she did. And they were both charged with multiple homicide because police officers are like, listen, we're not trying to figure out which one of y'all are lying. We're gonna let the jury figure that out.
Absolutely. What we really have to discover is what really happened, like what really took place. And prosecutors allege that on the night of the murder, which it all really started on March 3rd, because you remember it was in the early mornings of March 4th that a call was placed to the 911 dispatcher. So on March 3rd in 1995 at around 11:45, Antoinette Frank and Rogers Lacasse actually went to Kim On's restaurant for dinner. They actually sat down and had dinner. And that's when she requested to Chow Vu if she could pick up additional shifts. But Chow declined because Ronnie Williams was working that night. And that was kind of the end of their conversation. Now, she was furious. She felt betrayed, as we already know. MB kind of went through that with us. She wanted to seek revenge. So she left with Rogers after they had dinner, but she came back to the restaurant for a second time. This time, she picked up food. Now, it was at the second visit that Frank stole the key from Chow Vu. She actually stole her key to the front door. She knew that they would have about $10,000 in cash because she's worked with them before. So she knew kind of the number in which they would run for money. And around 1:40 a.m., Chow went to pay Ronnie Williams for his service because they had already closed for the night. But Chow noticed Frank approaching the restaurant. Now, this left her feeling kind of anxious and just kind of confused because Antoinette had already been at the restaurant. She ate there, she came back again to get more food, and she thought this was weird. So, instinctively, Chow went to the kitchen to hide the money in the microwave because it made her feel uneasy. She went to go grab her key to let Antoinette inside of the restaurant, but Antoinette used Chow's key that she had stolen. Right? She swiftly went past Officer Williams. Now he's kind of confused. He doesn't understand what's going on, right? Like he doesn't know if Antoinette's there for a reason, not really sure why she has her key. So Chow's brother Kwok and a restaurant employee are gathering into the doorway of the kitchen. Now, Officer Williams is following Antoinette very closely behind, trying to figure out what she wants. And that's when shots ring out. Roger Lacasse comes into the front door and shoots Williams from behind, instantly severing his spinal cord and leaving him paralyzed. So even if he wanted to do anything, he literally couldn't. And Roger then shot him in the head and back. Each shot was fatal. Antoinette turned her back to the restaurant dining room, retrieving the gun from Roger Lacasse. And it was at this moment that Chow grabbed her brother Kwok to find a place to hide. Now, Chow and Kwok slipped into the rear of the large walk-in cooler in the kitchen, turning off the light as they walked inside. They were unaware of the whereabouts of their other siblings. Han and Kwang Vu were sweeping the dining room floors when Antoinette entered the restaurant. Now, from inside the cooler, Chow and Kwok had a view of the kitchen and the front area of the restaurant. Initially, Chow saw Frank searching for something in the kitchen, but then Frank moved out of sight. So they couldn't see her. It wasn't this very clear visual that you would think. They could see her, but they were, somewhat out of sight sometimes. They heard gunshots fired, but then observed Frank searching where the Vus usually keep their money. Frank and Lacaze had been shouting at Han and Kwang, demanding the restaurant's money, but they didn't know where it was because they weren't the people who hid the money. It was actually Chow. Frank then pistol whipped 17-year-old Kwang when he hesitated in revealing the location of the money. Frank got the money out of the microwave, then shot 21-year-old Han 3 times as she knelt, pleading for her life. Then she shot Kwang 6 times. After Frank and Lacaze left the premises, Child tried to frantically call 911 on her cell phone. Keep in mind, this was 1995. Signals were not great in 95. The cooler honestly prevented her cell phone from getting a signal. Kwok emerged from the cooler and ran out the restaurant's back door to a nearby friend's home to call 911 to report the murders. Frank and Lacaze dropped off the money at a nearby apartment complex, but they knew they left people behind. Like they knew they left Chow and Kwok behind because, as we mentioned earlier, Antoinette knew who was in the restaurant. Frank heard the 911 call on a portable police radio saying that an officer was down at the Kim An's restaurant. She borrowed, because she was off duty, she goes back to the police department, borrows a patrol vehicle, and returns to the scene. But she wasn't anticipating that the New Orleans police officers would get there as soon as she would. She came into the restaurant intending to kill Chow and Kwok to ensure there were no witnesses left behind. She parked in the rear and entered through the restaurant's back door and made her way through the kitchen to the dining room where Chow waited for help at the front door. And as Chow fled through the restaurant's front door to safety of arriving officers, Frank immediately identified herself as a police officer, using that to her advantage. Chow then told Frank she knew what she had done and cried to officers in her native language, which is what we were talking about initially. And this is how the crime unfolded.
Antoinette Frank and Roger Lacaze were indicted by the New Orleans Parish Grand Jury on April 28, 1995. Now, their trials were separated, with Roger Lacaze being tried first from July 17th to the 21st of 1995 before Judge Frank Maralou. Lacaze was found guilty as charged and sentenced to death, primarily based on evidence that he used Williams' Chevron credit card at a Chevron station in Gretna just minutes after the robbery and murders.
I mean, it told a story even back in 1995.
Because, seriously, you're just if you're gonna be a criminal.
No, they're not gonna be smart. Mm-mm.
At Antoinette Frank's trial, it commenced on September 5th, 1995, and also presided over by Judge Marleau. Now, despite Antoinette Frank's attorneys subpoenaing 39 witnesses, they did not call any to testify. So basically what that means is they issued subpoenas to these 39 people, and they told them, hey, you need to be on standby because we may call you to testify in this case. However, they didn't call any of those individuals to testify at trial. The jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts after only a whopping 22 minutes of deliberation, and on September 12, 1995, they set a record for the shortest verdict in a capital murder case in New Orleans at that time. And I just want to clap, slow clap, for that jury because they understood the assignment. They absolutely understood the assignment. Antoinette Frank was sentenced to death in 1995. However, in 2010, Louisiana had a 15-year pause on execution. Now, there is a variety of reasons why this pause occurred, including difficulty obtaining drugs that you use for lethal injection, and just there was government changes and leadership where people were trying to figure out, do they even agree with it? And so during this time, 2010 to 2025, Louisiana paused their executions. Now, the executions resumed in 2025, specifically on March 18th, 2025. They had their first execution via nitrogen hypoxia, which is a method to enact lethal injection. These executions resumed in the state of Louisiana. Now, you're probably asking yourself, okay, MD, why does this matter? Well, because Antoinette Frank was executed, or not executed, but she was sentenced to death in 1995, she was eligible for the death penalty after she exhausted all of her appeals. But because Louisiana went on this 15-year pause in executions, and she had not exhausted all of her appeals prior to 2010, she became eligible for execution in 2025, but she was also eligible to file a post-conviction appeal against her death sentence. And so that motion is actually pending before the Louisiana Supreme Court. And on April 28th, 2025, her appeal to overturn her death sentence was heard, and state prosecutors were given a deadline to file a response to her case. So we're actually waiting to find out whether or not Antoinette will be sentenced to death, or if her death sentence will be overturned. Now, I want to caution you that even if it does get overturned, she will likely receive life in prison. Now, interestingly enough, Roger Lacasse, his death penalty conviction was overturned, and he now serves life in prison.
In 1993, a year and a half before the murders, Antoinette Frank's father stayed at her home for a time before she then reported him missing. In November of 1995, a month after she received her first death sentence, a dog led police to find a human skull with a bullet hole buried underneath Antoinette's house. Investigators believe that the skull that they found was the body or belonged to Antoinette Frank's father. However, because she had received the death penalty, they didn't feel a need to prosecute her for that particular crime. But it gives us all something to think about when we think about how Antoinette arrived at this very dark place. Takeaway for this case: we all have, some type of trauma in our lives, whether it be you had a relatively good childhood. There's something that you usually can recover from in your adulthood that was either traumatic or just overall just wasn't the right thing. This case highlights that Antoinette has some trauma in her life. Seeing her brother arrested, armed robbery and potential manslaughter, then to being poor and wanting to do better for herself, but having some very flagrant red flags in her psychological evaluation. However, her being able to pull strings and gain access to a profession she should have never been in the first place. This case highlights that part of childhood trauma and how that is represented in adulthood. But I think more so than anything, what I want to leave you guys with is that we all have choices, right? Ultimately, it's what you choose to do when you're an adult. And so I think we have to really think about what we're doing and the choices we make, because I'm sure there are plenty of people with the same challenges as Antoinette, but they didn't choose to murder someone. The other thing that I want us to think about is that she chose a profession where people were depending on her. Like, the Vus really felt comfortable with her because she was a police officer, because she was someone that we naturally have been told from yay high that we can trust and depend on. And I know, when you're Black, it doesn't always look like that. But we were all told the same narrative when we went to elementary school. You can depend on cops and they're good guys. This brings into question, in Black culture, we naturally question. But I think for others, you start to think when you hear these cases, man, can I really trust them though?
You can have good cops and you can have bad cops. And that's just how it is in every profession.
Absolutely. I'm interested to see, and I will be posing a poll for you guys to get your opinion on why do you think she ultimately chose the path in which she did. Doing more additional research, there's a documentary, and she tried to say that she didn't have a romantic relationship with Lacaze at all. And she didn't want to speak about that relationship. So I thought that was interesting. And she advocated that just because he had a criminal background doesn't mean that he wasn't a good person. And to hear her expound on that years after the murders happened and never once offered any type of remorse toward the Vu family and Ronnie Williams' family was just very telling.
Really interested in with this particular case is how she was able to jump the hurdle to get into the police force. And I say that because I know individuals that, not personally, like they weren't like my friend, but I've been in my peer group who didn't pass the psychological exam and therefore they did not get in. I mean, they've also have not gone on to commit murders and crimes that I know of. But because there's all kinds of reasons why you may not be able to pass the psychological exam, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're like a potential criminal. It could mean that you have like high anxiety, and in a profession where you're going to be dealing with anxiety ridden situations, maybe a person that's already prone to anxiety may not be able to get in. I don't know the rhyme and the reasons why you may or may not pass a psychological exam to get into the police force. But I guess my question as I read this case and learned about this case is, how was she able, after failing this psychological exam and the psychologist giving a recommendation of she should not be able to be a police officer, and then she writes a suicide letter, how she was able to still then get in? And I don't say that, I don't question that, thinking that had she not gotten in, she wouldn't have committed these murders, right? I mean, we don't know, but it's just interesting to me.
I want to offer a caveat is what's unknown is, was that suicide note something that we discovered after the fact? Like not while you know what I mean?
Right,
Is it hindsight? And then we a family member told us after she did this crazy stuff. So, I mean, yeah, we don't know, but I think you're right. I think obviously knew somebody who was able to say, hey, she on, and we can hide this paperwork that came up anyway at the end. But
it always comes to the light.
Yes. Let us know what you think about this case. Antoinette Frank is the only Black woman on death row there in Louisiana. Just another random fact. So once we find out the appeal process for her, the end of it, we will also let you know in a future episode. Until next time, this is Murdering the Black.